The hospital lobby was a hive of activity. Nurses hustled between patients, their shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum floors. Their voices blended with the distant wail of a siren and the rhythmic beeping of medical monitors. A mother soothed a crying child in one corner, while a man in a business suit argued with a receptionist about the wait time. Amidst this controlled chaos, an old man stumbled through the automatic doors. Robert Alexander, his clothes a patchwork of dirt and wear, looked like he'd been through a war. His face lined with age and hardship, twisted in pain. Each step was a labor, his hand clutching his chest as if to keep his heart from bursting out. His hair and beard, long and unkempt, framed his gaunt face, making his eyes appear even more haunted. "Help me," he gasped, his voice barely rising above the noise. "Please, someone help me." The reaction was immediate, but not what he needed. Nurses and staff glanced his way, some with thinly veiled disgust, others with outright amusement. They whispered among themselves, their glances sharp and judgmental. "Looks like we've got another one from the streets," one nurse muttered to her colleague, thinking he can pay. The other replied, a smirk playing on her lips. Robert's desperation grew as he felt the weight of their scorn. His body screamed for relief, but he found none in their eyes. Reaching into his pocket with trembling hands, he pulled out a sleek, black credit card. The card glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to his disheveled appearance. "I can pay," he said, his voice breaking. "Just please help me." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone stared at the card. Then the laughter began. It was harsh and mocking, filling the space with its cruelty. "Where did you steal that from, old man?" A security guard sneered, stepping forward. "Do you think we're stupid?" Robert's grip on the card tightened, his knuckles white. "It's mine," he insisted, the pain in his chest growing unbearable. "Please." As the guard moved closer, a clear, calm voice cut through the derision. "That's enough." Sarah, a young nurse with kind eyes and a determined expression, stepped forward. She had been watching the scene unfold from a distance, her face a mask of concern. Now she placed herself between Robert and the advancing guard. "This man needs help," she said firmly, "not ridicule." The guard hesitated, thrown off by her conviction. The other staff members looked at each other, unsure of how to react. Ignoring the whispers and the stares, Sarah turned to Robert. "Let's get you to a bed," she said gently, guiding him towards a wheelchair. "We'll take care of you." Robert looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "Thank you." Sarah wheeled him through the crowded hallway, weaving past gurneys and hurried doctors. She spoke to him softly, asking about his symptoms and reassuring him that he was in good hands. Her demeanor was professional but warm, a stark contrast to the coldness he had faced earlier. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked as they reached a treatment room. Robert Alexander," he replied, wincing as another wave of pain hit him. "All right, Mr. Alexander," Sarah said, helping him onto the bed. "We're going to take care of you. Just hold on a little longer." "All right, Mr. Alexander," Sarah said, guiding him onto a bed in a small examination room. "Let's get you settled. Can you tell me where you're feeling the most pain?" Robert winced, clutching his chest. "It's my heart and my head. Feels like they're both about to explode." Sarah nodded, her expression serious but gentle. She swiftly began attaching electrodes to his chest and taking his blood pressure, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Any history of heart problems?" she asked, glancing up at him. "Not really," Robert replied, his voice strained. Just a lot of stress lately." As Sarah continued her examination, she noticed the whispers and snickers from the hallway. Two nurses, both with skeptical looks, stood just outside the door, exchanging glances and hushed comments. "Did you see that black card?" One nurse whispered, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "Yeah, probably stolen," the other nurse replied with a smirk. "No way someone like him owns that." Sarah shot them a sharp look, her patience wearing thin. "If you two have time to gossip, maybe you could use it to help some patients," she said curtly. The nurses exchanged annoyed looks but shuffled away. Turning back to Robert, Sarah softened her tone. "Ignore them, Mr. Alexander. They're just... forget them." Robert managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Sarah. You're the only one who seems to care." Sarah's heart ached at his words. "Just doing my job," she said, though she knew it was more than that. "Let's get some tests done to see what's going on, okay?" As she prepared the necessary paperwork and arranged for further tests, Robert watched her with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "You're different from the others," he said quietly. Sarah paused, looking at him thoughtfully. "Why do you say that?" "Because you see me," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "not just an old man or a problem to be dealt with." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently. "I promise I'll stay by your side through this." The door swung open abruptly and Dr. Miller, the attending physician, strode in. He was a tall, imposing man with a perpetually stern expression. "What's going on here, nurse?" "Dr. Miller." Sarah began, standing up straighter. "This is Mr. Alexander. He's experiencing severe chest and head pain. I was just about to send him for a full cardiac workup." Dr. Miller glanced at Robert, his eyes narrowing. "And who's paying for all this? He doesn't look like he has insurance." Robert's face flushed with humiliation, but he held up his black card. "I can pay," he said firmly, though his voice trembled. Dr. Miller snorted. "You expect us to believe that?" Sarah stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "Dr. Miller, we have a duty to treat every patient who comes through these doors. He needs help, and he says he can pay. That's enough for now." The doctor hesitated, then shrugged. Fine, but if this turns out to be a waste of resources, it's on you, nurse. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. I'm sorry about that, Mr. Alexander. Robert shook his head. It's not your fault. People always assume the worst. Well, I don't, Sarah said firmly. Let's get you taken care of. She helped him onto a gurney and wheeled him toward the testing area. In the testing area, Sarah stayed with Robert, holding his hand as the technicians performed their work. The room buzzed with the low of machinery, punctuated by the soft clicks and beeps of the monitors. Robert lay still, his eyes darting around the room, a look of deep-seated anxiety etched on his face. Just a few more minutes, Mr. Alexander, Sarah said, her voice a steady anchor in the sea of his fear. You're doing great. Robert nodded slightly, but his eyes betrayed his unease. The technicians moved with precision, their faces masks of professional detachment. One of them, a young man with sharp features, glanced at Sarah and whispered, Do you really believe that card is his? Sarah shot him a warning look. It doesn't matter what I believe. Our job is to treat him, not judge him. The technician shrugged and continued his work. Robert closed his eyes, trying to block out the murmurs and focus on his breathing. Every inhale was a struggle, each exhale a battle against the pain gripping his chest. Minutes felt like hours before the technicians finally stepped back. We're done here, one of them said. The doctor will review the results shortly. Sarah helped Robert sit up, her touch gentle and reassuring. How are you feeling? Like I've been run over by a truck, Robert replied, a weak smile flickering across his lips. Thank you for staying with me, of course, Sarah said, helping him into a wheelchair. Let's get you to Dr. Miller so he can go over the results with you. As they made their way to Dr. Miller's office, Robert's grip on the wheelchair's armrests tightened. The anticipation was almost worse than the pain itself. Sarah knocked gently on the door and a voice called out, Come in. Inside, Dr. Miller sat behind a large desk, papers and medical charts spread out before him. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Mr. Alexander, please have a seat, he said, gesturing to a chair opposite him. Sarah helped Robert into the chair and stood by his side, her presence a silent reassurance. Dr. Miller scanned the test results, his brow furrowing. Mr. Alexander, he began, his tone clinical, we've reviewed your test results and I'm afraid the news isn't good. Robert's grip tightened on the armrests, his knuckles turning white. How bad is it? Dr. Miller took a deep breath. Your heart is in severe distress, and there's significant damage. Given the extent of your condition, you likely have about 12 days left. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Robert's face went pale, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall. 12 days? Robert echoed, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Dr. Miller said, his tone softer now. We'll do everything we can to make you comfortable, but there's nothing more we can do to reverse the damage. Sarah squeezed Robert's hand, her eyes filled with sympathy. We'll get through this together, Mr. Alexander. You're not alone. Robert nodded slowly, his mind racing. 12 days, he repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. That's not a lot of time. No, it's not, Sarah agreed softly, but we'll make the most of it. Dr. Miller cleared his throat. I'll leave you two to talk. If you need anything, just ask. As the doctor left, Robert looked at Sarah, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of regret and unspoken words. I've wasted so much time, he murmured, so many years gone just like that. It's not too late, Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. You can still make these days count. Robert sighed, a heavy sound filled with years of burden. You're right, I've got to make things right. Sarah sat beside him, her presence a comforting balm. Tell me about your life, Robert. What's on your mind? Robert's eyes grew distant, as if looking back through the corridors of time. I've seen a lot, done a lot. Not all of it good. I made my fortune, but it cost me everything, Sarah prompted gently. Robert nodded. Family, friends, my own happiness. I thought money could fix everything, but it only made things worse. Sarah listened intently, her hand never leaving his. It's not too late to find peace, Robert, to forgive yourself. Robert's eyes filled with unshed tears. Maybe, he said softly, maybe it's time to stop running from my past. Sarah smiled, a small but genuine gesture. I'll be here with you every step of the way. For the first time in years, Robert felt a flicker of hope. He still had time, and with Sarah by his side, perhaps he could finally find the redemption he'd been seeking. As the day turned into night, the hospital quieted, but in that small room, a journey was just beginning. A journey of reflection, forgiveness, and the search for peace in the twilight of life. The next morning, Robert woke with a newfound resolve. He felt a sliver of strength returning, and with it, a desire for a semblance of dignity in his final days. Sarah, Robert called out weakly as she entered the room with a fresh set of linens. Good morning, Mr. Alexander, she replied, offering a warm smile. How are you feeling today? A bit better, he admitted, though the pain in his chest still lingered. I've been thinking I want to spend my remaining days in a bit more comfort. Could you arrange for me to be moved to a VIP room? I have my black card. It should cover the cost. Sarah hesitated, concern etching her face. Are you sure, Mr. Alexander? Those rooms are quite expensive. Robert nodded firmly. I'm sure. I want to die with some dignity. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. All right, let me see what I can do. She left the room and approached the administrative desk. The receptionist, a stern-looking woman named Linda, raised an eyebrow as Sarah approached. "Yes, Nurse Sarah," Linda asked, not bothering to hide her disdain. "I need to arrange for Mr. Alexander to be moved to a VIP room," Sarah said, her tone professional. Linda snorted. "Must be out of her mind." And the other replied, "That card's got to be fake." Sarah ignored them, focusing on Robert. "Almost there, Mr. Alexander." When they arrived at the VIP suite, Robert's eyes widened in awe. The room was spacious and elegantly furnished, a stark contrast to the sterile environment he had endured. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you can imagine." "You deserve it," Sarah replied, helping him settle into the plush bed. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." As she arranged his pillows, a thought struck Robert. "Sarah, how did you manage to convince them?" Sarah hesitated and sighed. "Mr. Alexander, I used my own card to pay for the room." Robert stared at her in disbelief. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "Because it's the right thing to do," Sarah said simply, "and because I believe in you." Tears welled up in Robert's eyes. "But you're a nurse, not a wealthy woman. How could you afford this?" Sarah smiled gently. "I'm not wealthy, Mr. Alexander. I have a 7-year-old son at home, and I've been saving for his future. But when I saw you, I knew I had to help. Money can be earned back, but you don't have that kind of time." Robert was overwhelmed with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. This is beyond anything I could have hoped for." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah replied, squeezing his hand. "Just focus on getting comfortable. We'll take it one day at a time." The bond between them grew stronger in that moment, rooted in selflessness and a shared commitment to dignity and compassion. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the room, Robert felt a sense of peace wash over him. He was not alone, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen and cared for. The next morning, a sense of anticipation filled the air as Robert waited for the arrival of his lawyer. Sarah had informed him that she had managed to contact Mr. Reynolds, Robert's longtime legal advisor. The news brought a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Sarah asked gently as she adjusted Robert's pillows. Robert nodded firmly. "Yes, Sarah. It's time to set things right." Just then, the door to the VIP suite opened and a distinguished-looking man in his 60s entered, carrying a briefcase. His sharp suit and confident demeanor immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. "Mr. Alexander," the lawyer greeted, his voice warm but professional. "It's good to see you." "Reynolds?" Robert replied, a faint smile on his lips. "Thank you for coming." Reynolds turned to Sarah, his eyes appraising. "You must be the nurse who's been taking such good care of Robert." Sarah nodded, feeling a bit out of place amidst the formalities. "Yes, I'm Sarah. Nice to meet you." "Likewise," Reynolds said before focusing back on Robert. "Shall we get started?" Robert took a deep breath. "Yes, let's." Reynolds opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "First, there's something we need to discuss. Your identity, Robert." The room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah watched as Reynolds began to speak, his words clear and measured. "Robert Alexander is not just any man. He is, in fact, Robert Alexander, the wealthy hotel magnate who owns the Alexander Hotels chain." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. She glanced at Robert, who nodded slightly, confirming the revelation. Reynolds continued, "Mr. Alexander chose to live anonymously for personal reasons, stepping away from his empire to understand life from a different perspective." The news hit Sarah like a tidal wave. She had never imagined that the man she had been caring for was so influential and wealthy. Outside the room, the hospital staff buzzed with curiosity and disbelief as the news spread among them. Whispers echoed through the corridors, and a few nurses exchanged stunned glances. "Did you hear? That old man is a billionaire," one nurse exclaimed. "I can't believe it, and we treated him like dirt," another replied, shame coloring her voice. Back in the VIP suite, Robert reached out and took Sarah's hand. "Sarah, you have shown me a kindness and compassion that I have not experienced in years. I want to formally adopt you as my daughter." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "Robert, you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Robert insisted. "You have been more of a daughter to me than anyone else in my life. It's time I did something right." Reynolds cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "There are legal documents here to make this official. Robert wants to transfer all his assets to you, Sarah. This includes his entire estate and holdings." Sarah was overwhelmed. "Robert, this is too much. I can't accept this." Robert squeezed her hand. "You must. It's my way of thanking you and ensuring that you and your son are taken care of." Reynolds began explaining the documents, but the emotional weight of the moment was palpable. Sarah felt a deep sense of responsibility and gratitude. As they were signing the papers, a nurse knocked softly on the door and entered. "Mr. Alexander, sorry to interrupt, but there's a bit of a commotion outside. Some of the staff are talking about you." Robert sighed, closing his eyes for a moment. "Let them talk. It doesn't change what needs to be done here." The nurse nodded and left, leaving the door slightly ajar. The muffled voices of the staff could still be heard buzzing with the revelation of Robert's true identity. With the final signatures in place, the transfer of assets was complete. Sarah was now legally Robert's daughter and the heir to his fortune. The weight of the responsibility was immense, but so was her determination to honor Robert's wishes. "Ready?" Reynolds asked, standing by the door. Sarah took a deep breath, her hand still in Robert's. "As ready as I'll ever be." Reynolds exited the room to handle any immediate legal formalities with the hospital administration. Meanwhile, Sarah and Robert remained in the VIP suite, sharing a quiet moment. "Robert, I'm still trying to process all this," Sarah said, her voice tinged with awe. "Why did you choose to live anonymously?" Robert leaned back against his pillows, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I wanted to understand people, to see if kindness and genuine connections still existed without the influence of money. Meeting you proved that they do." Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "I'm honored that you think so highly of me, Robert. I promise to make you proud." "I have no doubt you will," Robert replied, his voice filled with conviction. As they sat together, the significance of the moment settled over them. Outside the room, the hospital continued its relentless pace, but inside, a new chapter had begun for both Robert and Sarah. In the days that followed, the bond between Robert and Sarah deepened even further. Sarah brought her 7-year-old son, Jacob, to meet Robert. The boy's wide-eyed curiosity and innocent questions brought a rare smile to Robert's face. "Hello, Mr. Robert," Jacob said shyly, hiding partially behind his mother. "Hello, Jacob," Robert replied warmly. "Come here, young man, I have a story to tell you." Jacob approached cautiously, but soon found himself captivated by Robert's tales of adventure and wisdom. These moments were precious, filled with laughter and the simple joys of storytelling. Robert took every opportunity to impart his life lessons to Jacob, hoping to leave a lasting impression on the boy. "Remember, Jacob," Robert said one evening, his voice soft but firm, "it's not what you have in life that matters, but who you have. Always be kind and cherish those who care for you." Jacob nodded seriously, absorbing the weight of Robert's words. Sarah watched them with a mix of sadness and gratitude, knowing these moments were fleeting but profoundly meaningful. Despite the deepening connection and the joy of these shared moments, the reality of Robert's condition was never far from their minds. The hospital staff continued to treat him with newfound respect, albeit still tinged with the awkwardness of their earlier behavior, but in the confines of the VIP suite, an atmosphere of peace and reflection prevailed. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the room, Robert felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. He knew his time was drawing near. He beckoned Sarah to his side, his eyes filled with a serene acceptance. "Sarah, it's time," he said quietly. "Promise me you'll take care of Jacob and yourself. Use the resources I've given you to make a difference." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she nodded firmly. "I promise. Robert, I'll make you proud." Robert smiled weakly, reaching out to Jacob, who clutched his hand tightly. "Be strong, my boy." "Take care of your mother." "I will, Mr. Robert," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. With his family by his side, Robert closed his eyes, a sense of peace washing over him. His breaths grew shallow, and within moments he passed away quietly, his hand still held by those he loved. The hospital staff, aware of the significance of the moment, maintained a respectful silence. Word of Robert's passing spread quickly, and even those who had once doubted him felt a pang of sorrow. Not long after Robert's death, a storm was brewing. A video recorded by a patient in the waiting area surfaced online, showing the hospital staff mocking and refusing to help Robert when he first arrived.